So I still have my debugger up and running, and now that I gave you a brief overlook of how it works, let's actually send another message here. Hit send, it breaks again because I didn't remove the breakpoint, and let's now fix that error we have. I showed you how we can navigate, so let's click this line here, or this button to move to the next line. Now it registers this code, and here you also see that it doesn't immediately execute this function, because if I click that button again, we jump to the end of this function here. And that makes a lot of sense because, as I mentioned, this function is just registered by Node.js to be executed in the future once the file is read. So for now, code execution will continue with the other lines. Now, the problem we want to solve is not inside of here though. But if you want to get notified once a part in here is reached, you can simply add a breakpoint there, resume execution, and it will break once it reaches that. So once that callback is triggered because the write file operation is done. But our problem, of course, is the message, right? And the message is not available here anymore. So this analysis is actually not useful to us. So let's remove that breakpoint and resume. And let's again run this one more time. And now let's not resume execution, but look into message. And we see message is message, and that looks wrong. We see that parsed body is message equals and then our value. Now, since this is what we store in the message constant, we now can tell pretty clearly that our error has to be stemming from that part here, because we clearly have our value in here, but then we seem to be extracting the wrong piece. Now, split also does its job, and you can even use the console here to, for example, run some commands. You can run parsed body split equal sign here and see what this returns. So you see you get an array with message and tsat because I mistyped test. Now this clearly tells you, okay, so split is working. I'm in theory getting all the values I need. So the only thing that can be wrong now is the value I'm extracting here. And indeed we see, message holds message, which is incorrect. Message is the first element in the array. So I seem to be extracting the wrong element from the array. And indeed, we are extracting the first one when we should be extracting the second one here. So let's now change this to a 1, and now we got this error fixed. Obviously, this is a bit of a constructed example, but this is just to show you how you can use the debugger to go through your code step by step, that you have to keep in mind that Node doesn't execute line after line, but as I explained multiple times now, that it registers callbacks which are executed sometime in the future, and which you therefore also have to control with breakpoints if you want to look into them. And with that, you should have some powerful tools for finding and fixing errors in your code. Now, we worked with the debugger a bit, and after this lecture, you'll also find a lecture with a link to a more detailed explanation of the debugging capabilities Visual Studio Code gives you. Don't learn them by heart, but feel free to explore them to get the most out of the debugger for you. Now, there are two things I want to show you or I want to draw your attention to. One is something you already saw. Let's add a breakpoint again, and again submit this. I already showed you that you can execute code here in that debug console at the bottom. So you don't just see the console logs here, you can also execute code here. For example, you can type a variable name here, so something which is available in your code at this point of time. In general, something which you can find in local or in block here or in global. So the things you find here, like message, you can also type that down there and hit enter to print its value. And this is of course not really useful for printing because you can see the value on the left too. But as I showed you for parsed body, you cannot just print the value, you can also run operations on it that will not affect your code as it's running, but that will allow you to look into it or try out some transformation before you add it to your real code. So whatever you run down there does not affect the code you run up here, but it is nice for you to understand your code. The other thing I want to show you is that for now, at the moment, if we change something in our code here, let's say we add a blank line, our debugger doesn't restart. But with NodeMon, we actually have a package that does allow us to restart. So it would be nice if the debugger would also restart if we change our code. Otherwise, it just behaves differently than the rest of our app, and we have to restart it manually. Now, to restart it, let's go back to the Explorer view for a second. We have to go to Debug and then add a configuration for Node.js. This adds the .vs Code folder with the launch JSON file. And this allows you to configure debugging for this project and how it behaves. You can click on Add Configuration to see some demo settings you can add, but you can also just type in there. And one setting you can add is Restart, and you can set it to True. You just have to make sure that you also add some other fields. For example, you have to make sure that NodeMon is used. And for that, you set the runtime executable not to Node, which would be the default, but to NodeMon here. So now it will use NodeMon, and it will restart the debugger when a change is detected, so that not just the server is restarted, but also the debugging process. Here, by the way, in this configuration, you can also define that it should always start with the app.js file, so that you can even have the routes.js file selected while starting debugging, and it will still go for the app.js file, which is more convenient than always selecting the file you want to debug first before starting the debugger. And you always have to pick the app.js file because that starts your server. So you can't say, I want to look into the routes.js file, so I'll start with that. It always has to be the app.js file because you always have to start the entire server. So here you can define that it will always pick that no matter which file you have currently open. You can also change the console where things are logged to the integrated terminal, which is the normal terminal. With this, if you save all of that and you now start debugging, it fails though. And the reason for this is that it will not use the local NodeMon, but it looks for it globally. Now to add it globally, you have to run npm install NodeMon-G. And now important, on Mac and Linux, you might need to add sudo in front of this. On Windows you don't, to get the right permissions to install this. With that, you might be prompted for your password. And now it will install NodeMon globally, which makes sure that if you ever run NodeMon in the terminal now, it will not fail with a not found error, but instead it will find it. And therefore now you can also run in this debugger here, which will use the global version. And you see it now opens the terminal, starts NodeMon. And if you now add a breakpoint somewhere and submit this again, it still works as before. Just important, you now see the terminal here logs all the things. You can still use the debug console to output message though. So you can still work with this as I showed it to you. So this is not stopped from working. This still is something you can use. But in the terminal, you get the normal output. And you have to use the terminal because if you now change something, it restarts the debugger and Node. And these are two separate processes. And if you stop the debugger, NodeMon has to quit separately or has to exit separately. And you do this by hitting Control-C here. And this couldn't be done in the debug console, which is why you have to funnel this to the terminal. So that's just something to keep in mind. You have to stop that process separately, which you can do from the terminal, which is why if you're using that NodeMon process, you should use the integrated terminal. And you can read more about that in that detailed Visual Studio Code debugging article. But now you have a setup where you have a debugger attached to your program that will restart if you added something, where the server will restart if you added something, and where you have now all the tools you should need to debug your Node app and hopefully solve any errors you get. Now, one important note, for the rest of the course, I'll mostly use npm start and not have the debugger attached all the time. I will only use that if there is some error I wanna particularly debug with the debugger and wanna find with the debugger. So you can use it as a default always on option. I prefer to not use it, to not have that extra panel and so on, but to really just use the server and work on that. There's one more feature about the Node.js debugger which I also haven't shown you yet, but which I of course don't want to forget. If you start debugging here, and here I just used the shortcut, and you place a breakpoint anywhere in your app, and then do something to trigger that breakpoint, I showed you that you can look into all these variables and that you can look into them in the debug console without changing them. Well, sometimes you might want to change them. And that can be done by going to the debug view here, and then by simply typing in there. Now, for example, the parsed body holds this string, and you can just change it. And now this will affect the runtime, as you can see if you hover over this. So now if I just resume execution with my code, which doesn't have a bug right now, and I go back to my Explorer view here, then you will see that I stored testing here, which is the value I edited in the debugger. So you can actually manipulate the values there of the variables and so on if you need to. You can do that because this, of course, allows you to make sure that you can quickly test something. This is just another useful feature which I wanted to share with you since it can help you with debugging your code, being able to manipulate some values there. Now in this module, we had a look at how we can have an easier time developing or building Node.js applications, I guess. And for this, we started with NPM, the Node Package Manager, which allows us to manage our project and mostly its dependencies, but also which added this package.json and gave us the opportunity of adding scripts there. So with npm init, you can initialize a new project. You basically add a package.json with that command. And then you saw that you can use scripts to, well, define shortcuts to commands you run all the time anyways. We also use npm to install third-party packages though, because Node projects typically don't just use the core modules or your own code, but often you want to pull in third-party packages. Utility packages like NodeMon, as we did it here, but also, as you will see in the next section, real big packages that we use in our production code. Express.js is what we'll install there. You can install different kinds of dependencies, which doesn't really make a difference. You could use them all even without specifying any of these options, but it helps you keep track of which dependency you're using for what. --save and --save dev allow you to differentiate between production and development dependencies, and global dependencies with -g can be run from within the terminal without getting a command not found error. Speaking of errors, well, in your code you often have errors. That is absolutely normal. And there are different types of errors you can have a look at. Syntax, runtime, and logical errors are the three categories of errors I identified. Syntax and runtime errors at least throw a hopefully helpful error message, and you should read these messages and look at the line numbers they give you, because that often helps you find out what went wrong and how to fix this. Logical errors often are more difficult to fix, but you can fix them often with a lot of testing and possibly the help of the debugger, which you learned how to use with the help of Visual Studio Code in this section. Speaking of debugging, debugging can be a helpful process because you can use VS Code or debuggers of other IDEs that can be used with Node to look into your code whilst it's running and step through it step by step. You can analyze variable values at runtime, and you can not just look into them, but you can also manipulate them as you learn. You do all that by setting breakpoints so that you define when your code execution should stop and give you an opportunity to look into the code. You can define more than one breakpoint at a time, and you should manage them cleverly. Keep in mind how Node code executes, that it's not line after line, but that it works with callbacks and is event-driven. And therefore, if you want to look into a callback, you have to add the breakpoint there and not right before it. With all that, you hopefully got useful tools that help you build your Node.js applications.